So let's go back a bit in time and talk about voice and why that has remained so important. I think there's a number of reasons. You know, it remains the most familiar, long-standing channel. We've spent a lot of money on it. It's still the most versatile, and we still trust it. You know, we still keep going back to voice if nothing else works at the end of the day. And that's an important point, because if you're going to try and provide alternatives in terms of other channels, that is the benchmark against which still a lot of the customers are referencing. And a lot of us go, I don't like the queue much, but I'll stay in there if it needs to be solved. And so it's a question of trying to remodel that. And I said I would share this data with you. So Contact Babel, 2003, 10 years later, 2013. The blue in that model says telephone was 91%. In that model, it says it's 73%. Not a great deal of change. The only thing that's grown is this staggeringly modern channel called email. What? If you then go to 2014, emails moved from 15 up to 16, wowzer. And then we're beginning to see web chat and stuff turning up there. Now, back to my point about customer feedback and triangulation. I don't just believe this source. I compare that to everything else and sort of divide by 2. And normally, if I see the chat vendor version of this, of course, chat's massive. You know, it's a funny old world, that. So the truth is somewhere in the middle. But the underlying point to come from this is nobody's got a big track record yet in proper multi-channel stuff. That's the most important thing to take away. And this other model is talking about, are we seeing channels grow or not? And so what we're seeing here is people giving feedback, saying web collaboration, that's basically self-service. The biggest digital channel, by the by, is web self-serve. And Forrester came up with an interesting, tipping point number, saying there were more people in the States, at least, doing web self-serve than they were trying to talk to us on the telephone, just as an indication of that change of customer behavior. So that's growing a lot. Social, potential growth there. Text, potential growth there. SMS, not sure what the difference is there really particularly. And telephone self-serve. So again, we're beginning to see text channels and self-service growing in the mix, as we might expect. So the net result of that is that we're unlikely as customers to receive an experience that is similar across those channels. And indeed, there are industries that make it deliberately more difficult by attaching cost centres to each channel. Insurance, in the UK at least, is particularly guilty of that point. And what happens when you give somebody a budget and a channel? They've suddenly got turf. They want their channel at all costs. Are they interested in anybody else? No, you've just created a silo. Interestingly, I knew somebody at RBS who was doing social. Very, very good, she was. In fact, social at the time was so new, they didn't know what you should be doing with it. And one of the directors went, what are we going to do? And there was a particularly bright executive PA. And they said, oh, maybe Mildred could do it. Mildred was bloody good, by the way, and she ended up delivering a 12-minute SLA on social and doing a staggeringly great job. And she came along and did a presentation once on it, and I was really blown away. She was doing fantastic stuff. And I said, so, who do you report into? And she said, oh, we report into the chat team. Social reports into the chat team. That's interesting. Why is that? Oh, we went to a site visit to O2, and that's what they do. That's a weird idea in the context of multi-channel. So, there's some weird stuff that goes on at the moment in terms of who owns which bit. You've often got the divide there, by the way, between online and call centres. Oh, that's e-commerce. Oh, we're call centres. Who owns web chat? They do, we do, And it doesn't lend itself, which is again why journeys are so good at mapping and making the point we belong to the same business. I haven't got it on my deck here, but I will make the point. Do you realise you don't work for an organisation? So it might be a staggering revelation. You don't work for the brand. What you do work for is a function. You work for the boss, and the boss is your functional boss. Their agenda is yours, if you want to keep the job. The only time you relate to the brand is twice. Once when you're applying for the job, you think you're going to go and work for them. And the second time is when the CEO turns up on the annual, hello, how are we? Yeah? Glad you're all doing well. Now go back into your silos and go and do your stuff. It's deep, and we see that same behavior across here. So one of the most important points I'm getting across here is, I think I've got the next slide here. Oh, there we go. Just wait for it to build. Guess what? This is Accenture talking about relatively young audience across millennials, 8 countries. It should come as no surprise that we expect it to work, and guess what? It doesn't work. And here is another piece of evidence. It's UK-based, but I'm pretty clear this applies anywhere on the planet. They, Eptica, do a great job, by the way, of mystery shopping the 100 top brands across all the sectors. And they do some really quite interesting questions and quite interesting observations as a result of that. And if you haven't downloaded that, I really would commend it. It's a great piece of research, and it's got a lot of very interesting stuff. One of the most depressing things, by the way, on channels is the discrepancy of answers that you're given according to the channel that you communicate on. And still, you can use email, social, and phone, and end up with 3 completely different answers. And why is that? Well, because everyone does knowledge management via little yellow stickies. And the little yellow stickies are all out of sync. Anyway, interesting. Last year's perspective was huge discrepancies between best and worst and across channels. And what we've got this year is we're getting a bit faster, but accuracy isn't very good, consistency is lacking, and very few people have got it together. So I promised you comfort in that we all belong to a certain level of mediocrity. There's the evidence of it. And in reality, this is where we all are right now. Now, you might be individually good at one channel, but you're not good at the joined up when you look at it from the customer's perspective. So one of the big... Oh, let me come back before we get to the big aha. That really doesn't work for you because of the lighting. So I'll explain what you'll notice when you see the slides on your own screen later on. This is talking about which channels are used in which sector. So that sort of colour is email, that colour is Twitter, and that colour is chat. And you can probably guess that there is no sector in which all of them are firing on full cylinder. And what you've found is that people have been quite selective. And the point that Eptica has made is that many brands are simply failing to respond via certain channels. Digital equivalent of slamming a door in a potential customer's face. And one of the reasons is that they're still trying to swap the cost of voice to another one, and they're really not very interested in opening up the cost. Which does raise the problem that it probably is more expensive when you go multi-channel, unless you have a twin strategy around a simplification. And it's very, very important to optimize the amount of self-serve you can do as early as you can, knowing that you've then got a remainder which needs to be live, and then how you can deliver that. Otherwise, you really do get yourself into a logjam. So I would recommend this to you. This is still going to remain true, I think, for a number of years, which is this. Focus upon being consistent. And the other thing I would say to you, by the way, in order to know if you're doing that, drink your own champagne. How many people are brave enough to consume their own IVR on a regular basis? It can be very illuminating. Be your own mystery shopper, seriously. And try moving across devices. Try getting a problem solved using different channels. It's the best way to learn. Absolutely is the best way to learn. And so, if you use voice of the customer to discover what does and does not work, that then gives you a pretty good idea about the journeys and the tasks and therefore the priorities of the customer. That then tells you how you should be building and delivering your capability. And I would say if there is one thing that probably matters most at the infrastructure level is this thing called a unified queue. Because if you do buy separate channels and you don't bring them together at all, you are running separate queues which means that you can't use people in any effective way blended. You also have got separate business rules, and you have also, and it's very difficult then to prioritize across those different channels, and also you've got separate MI. So it's important to have, if you want, a channel which is essentially agnostic to the type of communication, which, remember, is just voice, text, and video. And the business rules sitting in there allow you to say what goes faster, what goes slower, and how does that get moved together. When you plug in the CRM, you're then capable of doing this situational routing I was talking about, as opposed to simply it's because we have available resource, which is not really what the customer wants. But however you do that, consistency of experience in this early phase of multi-channel is not something that people are achieving. So if you're trying to use service as a source of competitive advantage, that's the goal at this phase. So, having made my points about the fact it's not very good right now, one of the reasons voice remains more sticky than it might do is better the devil we know, and we often still revert back to voice at the end of the day. You know, email historically has always been very much a asynchronous channel, at times, born in times where our expectation for a quick response wasn't that great. And still you find organizations that have got 7 to 10 days, SLA, and they think that's great. Oh, we're achieving our SLA. Really? By whose definition? And it's interesting. Email, by the way, is great if you change it. I know somebody in the UK, and it's worth this, the conversation. They've changed their SLA around of email from 48 hours to 4 hours. As a result of which, they've got 40% more traffic going through email than they were voice. But, and this is the but, would that work for you? All depends. Know thy customer, because in their situation, they're flogging talent management software. So their decision maker is an HR person who is available during office hours on a traditional screen. Those screens are very good for email, aren't they? That's almost default way of communicating. Now, the requirements that particular community had was, I need that kind of answer probably at 2 points in the day, either by lunch or before I leave. I don't really need it live. That's not my thing. But then I get the benefit of email, which is send it and forget it. And then it turns up, I can easily find it, I can log it, I can file it, I can get all the benefits that I get from that thing there. In that situation, it absolutely worked to drag it from 2 days into 4 hours. Voice suddenly became a redundancy. I don't need to talk to you like that. I can just get an email, put off. If it's a reliable channel, it works for me. Would that work if you were dealing with a predominantly younger community in another context? Possibly not. So again, I'm just over-exaggerating the point. Know your customer situation to know the kind of channel that will best serve that situation. And if you don't get that right, we revert to type. Right, let's have a bit of fun now, just to whiz through and talk about customers and trends and all of this stuff. And I'll give you the punchline here, which is know this in the context of your customers. So it's fun to see it on the screen, it's fun to come along to presentations, but we are now in a time where you should be able to build your own digital profiles. And if you don't know how to do that, by the way, if you do go onto my website, I was incentivized to write a post on that point. So it's out there right now, and it seems to be trending and doing quite well. How to build a digital profile. And it comes out of this stuff. So if you want to try and understand customers and what they're about, we've got 4 big things going down: empowerment, social stuff, multi-screen, omni-channel behavior, and personalization. This is a good example of empowerment that we have as a consumer. You know, so Argos, as a good example, as a retailer responding to that, has got pop-up shops that are now available on the London Underground. They have just nested themselves in Sainsbury's. Goodness knows what that's going to do. But the point is, their behaviour is experimental. Let's find out. We don't know any longer what doesn't work. We're going to go into a continuous state of experimentation to find out, because otherwise we suffer that syndrome. And, we do that. Makes sense. We do that. And if they can't provide me with a better offer, I'm afraid Amazon gets my business. Services branding. This is still one of my favourite little examples. I've actually got a more recent one of Virgin doing this, but this lady, Sarah Steely-Smith, is currently actually the IT director at Deloitte, believe it or not, in America. She's quite a sassy person, and she often communicates on social because she's very comfortable there. She's just talking to the airline about hot husband, who's a lucky man, obviously, and saying he's coming home, I'm going to miss him. Now, from the point of view, by the way, of service, I don't need to respond to that at all. But what they do is a superb job of staying on brand, in rapport, and make something of it. And one of the great things about social, of course, is that it becomes a branding opportunity if you do it brilliantly. So that's the world that we're increasingly sitting in. And by the way, although this is not a discussion about social, it's always great to ask yourself this question. If social makes the standard of your service visible to everybody, here's the litmus test. Would you currently like to have your complaints process run online? And if the answer is, you've got to be kidding me, it gives you some indication of the journey you've still got to make on that. Here we go. Service as a public voice of the customer. This is actually one of my customers in the UK. It's a housing association. I don't think I've put their name up there, have I? But what's interesting is the timeline, in the sense of the same problems are being repeated over and over and over. And indeed, if you know the housing market, you will know that the number one issue you've got is repairs. And guess what? It's rather like if you're a utility, billing is the thing you've got. So that's their eternal problem. But if it now suddenly pops up online, how do you prevent that turning into a corporate mugging, where a whole estate suddenly gets incensed and comes at you? "60% of folk use at least 2 devices every day. Nearly 25% use 3. What gets us to swap them? Well, it depends, as we said earlier on the situation, the complexity, the security, the privacy. That makes it really quite difficult to know who's what and where. I mean, the one thing we do know for sure is smartphones are pretty much around the place and the future's mobile. I mean, that's no big secret. Do you know, though, what percentage of your customers contact you via smartphone? That's a good question. Because if particularly you have customers who are B2B, well, it doesn't really matter. A lot of us used to phone from work, didn't we? A lot of us used to use the landline at work, which in fact masks the telephone number as a source of ID. If I'm phoning you on mobile, I know you, or else I should have collected your mobile number. And it's no coincidence that the ability to spot and identify a customer as they come through by referencing CRM has really improved because of the ubiquity of smartphones. Have you caught up with that point? Because if not, there's a ton of really clever stuff you can be doing at the queuing level before they even hit somebody. We shouldn't really be transferring people these days. It's a waste of their time and our resource. Personalization. This is just a bit of fun, but illustrates what we're up against. Bearing in mind that the call center is still a volume model, an industrialized model coping with the volume that's coming in, it's very interesting to see how our marketing colleagues have been pursuing this idea of personalization. And back to my little jibe about what is digital, one way I would characterize it is that digital has freed up a ton of information. It continues to generate a ton of information. And the characteristic of that is that it's real time. Now, you go, so, I've heard that before. But the so what about that is that we are still very much conflicted by the point that if it's real-time information, surely our decision-making needs to become real-time. And I can quote you many brands right now that have gone down the voice of the customer route. Oh, yes, we've got our little insight team. And what do? They do insight stuff, put it into PowerPoint, wait for the end of the month, present it to the exec talk about it and put it in the drawer. That's not real time by any stretch of the imagination. And a lot of those teams, by the way, are very frustrated as a result because they're stuck in their little silo, gathering stuff that needs immediate response, but they can't. So back to my point. Digital enables a ton of real-time information, and yet our decision-making is not real-time. That's very difficult. This now is real-time. So look at this situation. You are in Paris, lucky you. You've just been doing some shopping in a particular Shoe Boudoir shop, and the problem always with having bought something, you need to buy something else to go with it. We understand that point. And what happens is, because you have given permission to this form of engagement, your smartphone suddenly bursts into light and starts vibrating or doing whatever it does, and actually asks you the question, how about getting some inspiration? Now, inspiration in this particular context is a branded experience in the shopping mall. And what it actually means is, would you like to go along to a physical corridor which is within the shopping mall? If you do, then you get this experience. The first thing that happens in terms of real-time data collection is you get scanned. One of the interesting things, by the way, about data is you have to give up a certain amount of. This is not, by the way, then retweeted live. You'll be happy to know. All that they're trying to do there is to understand some of the basic demographics about you. And it says, right, this is clearly a female customer, probably at that age range, of that height. As a result of that, when you walk into the tunnel, we can now display from the combined inventory of the whole of the mall the stuff that is most appropriate to that initial profile. That initial profile is then further refined when you scan in what you have just purchased, and through business rules and all the clever stuff in the background, you'll have a further refinement of the choices that will probably mix and match. The process of purchasing is dangerously easy. Touch it and it's yours. And the clever thing that happens is that as you are doing that, it gets synchronized onto your mobile. It's physically there, suddenly available. And the last little coup d'etat then is it's geolocated in terms of which store, so you have a little map to then go and collect the pits. That's how shopping is going to be soon. Whoa, that's clever, isn't it? You look staggered. See, that's going to be amazing. So my point's this. If all these little examples are coming through... By the way, let's just go back to the basics. You know this, but it's worth refreshing ourselves. There is no such thing as a standard front page on Amazon, is there? 40 people in the room, 40 versions of Amazon. So our marketing colleagues are conditioning us to expect real-time personalization. My question then is, so what are we doing in contact centers? Very poorly is the answer. I ask you twice who you are, forget you next time, expect you to go through the same old procedure, and never act on anything that I've collected from you, and expect you endlessly to give me more information from which I get very little value, thank you very much. It sits in the database, inert. Pretty pathetic, really. So what are we going to do about that? And I would ask you to think about that problem when you go home, which is, what do we already know from all that information that we're collecting about the customer, and what are we doing to personalize the experience? Because if there is one thing that the modern customer, you, is expecting, is that it needs to be relevant. Because if all this information is whizzing around the place, at a human level, we just need to filter that out. I don't want the junk stuff any longer. I've had 3 generations of direct marketing. I'm exhausted. I've had 5 generations of bland advertising. I don't trust you. That's where we come from. That's our filter to survive the information overload. So the only way you're going to come through at me is if what you say hits home. And I'm not going to give you a ton of information so you can personalize it in an asynchronous way by sending me an email 3 weeks later. Got to be there and then. Now, is our contact center able to respond to that challenge? Because that particular expectation has been set very clearly by our marketing colleagues. So I would say this is one of the big ahas that we need to get our heads around of in contact centers. which is this, one size does not fit all. So if I set you the challenge, and it's worth actually, we'll have another little conversation, but if I set you the challenge of could you do personalization at scale, how would you go about that? It's an interesting question, isn't it? Working from a bland mass called customers coming in at us, could we start to identify different customer situations and respond? Does anybody yet know how to recognize a VIP customer and treat them differently, outside of hoping you've got some advisors who get the point, eventually see it on the screen, and talk to them in a nicer way than they might other people? Is anybody able to use automation?
Yeah, we use a program called Social Web.
Very good.
We have it for Twitter, Facebook, their sites more visible for that, or if they're in the forum, we recognize them to be a paid. SW automatically sets them as P1 and they top the queue.
Yeah. Yeah. Excellent example. So a modern platform, such as the Lithium one, automates the business of recognizing importance. Now, you've actually got that capability yourself, although you might not have joined the dots. You know a ton of stuff already about your customers in CRM. And there's many, many ways to talk about VIP. It could be they've bought a lot from us, they're valuable. It could be in the social context, they have influence, so they're important to us. However you define it, the information is sitting there. The key point is, what are you doing with that? So let me give you another situation, routing based on that. We do know a VIP customer because we said it conforms to the following criterion. Therefore, when a customer comes in from a smartphone, so we know who they are, we go look up those particular fields and go, bingo, that's a VIP customer according to the way that we define it. When do we use it? By comparing that then to our traffic. We know we are busy when? Monday mornings. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. One of the benefits of being VIP is you don't get to sit in the queue. So it's pretty simple to message a customer saying, thank you. By the way, busy period. You're not going to have to wait. You're going to be put straight through. That's because you're a VIP customer. We appreciate your business. You could do that today. Apart from the mindset isn't in the right place. It's not difficult to do. And that starts to deliver that sort of objective. So what I'm not talking about is using the advisors to produce the personalization. That's absolutely important. But can you do that before the event? Can you recognize that situation? And it comes back to all sorts of stuff. We could be discussing this from the other context, by the way, of proactive, which I know has been quite a popular theme of late and will continue to be even more so. Why do I have to before X, Y, Z? Why can't you anticipate and therefore? Claims management, very interesting. Anybody running claims in their organizations? All right, well, let's just take that as a discussion. Why do I have to keep phoning you on claims? You probably promise you're going to phone me back, never do. I have to keep chasing you. But if you examine what's happening in claims, it's a highly gated set of decisions, isn't it? Have the following things happened before we can do this, before we can do that? Why don't we just attach an automatic messaging service at each of those points and push the answer out so I know what's going on? Not too difficult to do, even with current technology, probably even with your technology. The thing that stops us doing that, though, is imagining that situation and trying to help the customer out before the event. So contact centres are generally downstream reactive organisations. The trick of this is to become upstream anticipating organisations. And by the way, if you do that, it's a win-win. You're going to have less traffic, which is a win-win from the cost perspective, and either customer never wanted that problem anyway. Thank you very much. Eliminate it, and I'm happy. Anticipate it, I'm happy. So the essence of real-time is to capture that issue as early as you possibly can and to predict. And the smartest organizations are, metaphorically as Amazon's doing, putting the thing you next want closest to you before you yet know you need it. Choice is another part of our behavior. And that diagram, if you had a bit more time to read it, simply says there is a gap between what we expect to have as available and usage. A certain logic would say, therefore, that's a redundancy. We don't need it, just keep it for the knitting. But that misses a key point. We expect to be able to get hold of you any which way. You need to be available to us. So again, how do you deliver on that? Interestingly, mobile as a behaviour, it is terrifying that the majority of us look at it in the bathroom, when I'm at work, when my partner talks to me, which might explain a lot of the problems going on right now, while socialising with friends, and even during dinner. Who has a rule around a dinner and no phones? Yeah, there you go, absolutely. You have to survive that stuff. You know, it is very weird what that device has become. We can't let go of it at all, you know. In the old days, we used to have a fag in the morning. What we now do is just go straight to the smartphone, don't we? Yeah. In there, as if something vital's happened. God, you know, when's my next film? You know, etc., etc. So, very, very important, mobile. And by the way, the thing that's frightening about mobile is this point. Smartphone uptake is a huge driver of multi-channel. Customers don't particularly differentiate between phone, email, and all the rest of it because it's on the same channel. They think it's the same super flexy channel. That's terrifying. And here's another interesting thing. Even when you still stump up to have a live human being sitting there, being available, 50% of people would still prefer to go online and find friends and family. It's no surprise, by the way, that Walmart has just bought another 6,000 robots. This is part of a bigger conversation, by the way. This is Uber automation. Yeah, and it's frightening. Why? Because Walmart is a low-value, retailer. Therefore, their wages are going to be very, close to the bone. The kind of person that you're going to get from that is not going to be a highly motivated person, a well-educated person, etc., etc. You can have these cute little things which look gorgeous. Everyone loves interacting with them. A complete full knowledge base in them. They never complain. They don't cost anything beyond the initial investment. They whiz around. Where does that stop? That's a bigger conversation, by the way. So, in summary, here we go, the same old summary. It's important that with all that behaviour, we absolutely understand what people are trying to achieve. It's based on choice, it's based on situation, it's based on the use of all these different devices. We need to stay very, very close to that. So coming back to this, one of the most important things that we have to do to be successful at multi-channel is understand situations, understand journeys, which really means voice of the customer. You have to switch your voice of the customer right up to 11. And it has to be valuable, relevant to customer service requirements, and you need to keep tracking them. Your customers, in digital terms, will be different in 2017 than 2016 than 2015. Do you know those differences? If you don't, you won't know what to provide them with. That's the first major important thing. Secondly, you will not survive multi-channel unless you get a very tight grip upon automation from the sense of self-determination. When you've heard Nicola Millard do this slot, she's talked about the autonomous customer, which is a good description. And it really says we want things on our own terms, whenever, however. So getting your self-service working is incredibly important. That is no longer a business of shoving it in a big bucket and saying, go drink from it. It's about providing it in very, very simple ways to consume. And increasingly, virtual assistants are becoming popular and work well. And by the way, if it is a mobile device, I haven't got it on this deck, go and have a look and see what visual IVR looks like. One of the most interesting things about IVR is it sucks as an auditory medium. It's just not very useful to provide a ton of choices when we have to hear it. I can't remember. But if I can physically see it, and the funny thing is when it's on my device, I feel you've given me choice, I feel empowered, that really works. And routing in the future is likely to be achieved through that route of this visualization over a mobile device, in which I can choose the thing I want to talk to you about, which I can then see on the screen. I can choose which channels, and I can also choose maybe when I want to engage with you, particularly if you can feed me back, this is the length of the queue in voice, chat, whatever right now. And by the way, if I also access CRM, I can be even more clever and say, I know you prefer these channels, or you are important, therefore the following will happen. And by the way, if you've already identified for me, in particular, what you want to discuss with us, I'm much more likely to be able to offer you relevant knowledge because I'm talking about a particular situation you've got, as opposed to saying, here's a Google box, you go search. So the important thing, by the way, going into the future is if you combine mobile plus multi-channel, we're not just adding channels, we are fundamentally changing the way in which we can deliver that service, which is, again, another really good piece of news. So that voice of the customer needs to include the question, what is the profile of my customer? That's what I mean by the digital profile. And digital is trying to find out to what extent are they using smartphones. You know, easy question. Who does online banking? That's an indication of trust, of a certain way of engagement. How many people are buying via their mobile devices yet? Do they trust that? Do they not trust that? Even asking the question about how do you consume TV is interesting. There's huge choice in terms of TV these days. You know, are you still watching that big old thing? Or do most people watch it on that size or that size? You know? Have you killed the equivalent of Sky and you just do the Netflix thing any longer? It's interesting. Where do you get your news from? Newspaper, online? All of these are little proxy decisions about somebody's gradual migration into an increasingly digital world. And with that comes a package of behaviors. And, you know, being able to understand where your customers are relative to that journey, they'll probably sit in segments like that, helps you then understand what matters to them. And the last thing I want to just put in there is do not do any of this without a continuous improvement loop. Because as our expectations go up as customers in this world, I don't want to see the same old, same old. Do you remember that Facebook timeline where the same problems have been repeated? Increasingly, you are visible as a service brand. And we can talk about you into very easy terms these days. It just doesn't work to be giving people the same old, same old. So make sure you're taking off the table all those stupid recurring issues. Apart from anything else, it's good hygiene and it makes the cost of delivery cheaper. So it's time to crack the self-service. So the interesting point in summary is this. It's not just a question of buying a bunch of channels from Graham. That's the easy piece. You've really got to get into a new mindset here around of delivering service in a new context because those customers are different. You need to understand what they're trying to do. You need to simplify. You need to provide an increasing amount of autonomy in the consumption of that in terms and the context of delivering choice. That's the end state. You've then got to figure out how you get there. And the best way to do that is understand what matters to the customer right now. You don't have a bunch of customers that are totally digital today. You have a bunch of customers that are moving on a journey. Can you divide them into blocks and understand where they're at, and then you manage your migration based on where they're at? That's all I've got to say.